Welcome to Silver River Chairs. I'll be teaching you how to weave a shaker tape seat into a chair today. Shaker tape is a cotton strapping that is woven in a warp weft method. Shaker tape can come in several different sizes as well as a whole range of colors. The combination of colors and patterns makes this a really versatile material to use for weaving. Shaker tape primarily comes in 1/2 inch and 1 inch. The amount of material that you will need for your seat is dependent on the size, of course. The smaller material will give you a more stable and structurally sound seat. This is just a sampling. Different manufacturers have different colors available. There's some wonderful stripes as well as the solids. When weaving with shaker tape, you do want to pay attention to dye lots. You want to order as much material as you will need for your project, whether it's one chair or a set of 6. You don't want to run into an issue where you've ordered material and ran out and then end up with new material that's just a slightly different color. Also, this cotton strapping does have a tendency to fade over time. This chair that has seen some sun, you can see the difference. And then when you start to look at the underside of the chair, you can definitely tell the vibrance is different. Before ordering material, the first thing that you'll want to do is figure out how much you need. There are 3 measurements that we'll be dealing with. The first measurement is from post to post on the front rail. That's what we're calling A. B is going to be post to post on the back rail. And then C is between the front rail and the back rail. And this is going to give you a pretty good estimate of the square inches of your seat. For our project, A plus B divided by 2 is 12 3/8, and 12 3/8 times C is 160 and some change. Alternatively, for a more conservative estimate, you can just use the measurements A across the front rail and C from the front to the back rail. You'll see in this example that you end up with the square inches of 182 versus 160. It'll ultimately give you more material, but you're less likely to run out. Now that we've determined the approximate square inches, we're going to use one of these division factors depending on if we're using a 5/8 inch tape, use 11, or a 1 inch tape using 18. Today we're going to be using 5/8 inch tape, so we'll be dividing our area by 11. Using the more exact square inches, we have 160.875 divided by 11, which yields you 14 yards in each direction. So, and I would round that up to 15 yards for sure. The more conservative estimate of the square inches gives you 16.5 yards. In this chair, the warp strands are the striped that go from front to back. and the solid strands, the weft, go side to side. Using the conservative estimate, we know that we need 16.5 yards for the warp strands and 16.5 yards for the weft strands. Altogether, you're looking at about 33 yards of material in order to complete your chair. If you have a single color, then that'll be 33 yards of that single color. In this example, you'd be ordering 16.5 yards of the striped material that makes up the warp and 16.5 yards of the solid material that makes up the weft. Alternatively, because the warp and the weft of this chair are the same material, you'd just be ordering 33 yards and that would take care of the whole thing. When weaving with shaker tape, you end up with 2 layers of material with the rails in between. We like to fill that space with a 1-inch upholstery foam. The foam makes it so that when you're sitting on the top layer of the chair, it transfers the load to the bottom layer of the chair as well. The easiest way to do the foam is by turning your chair upside down onto a panel of foam. You want to keep about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch along the edges so that your foam doesn't show through any of the shaker tape. It's easy to just take a Sharpie, mark the edge. You do want to take the corners off of your piece of foam, because if there's one place that you're going to see the foam, it's going to be right in the corners of your pattern next to the posts. Here we have our chair, and we're about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch off of the sides and way far away from these posts. What we don't want is for the foam to be coming all the way to the posts, and then you're able to see it in that gap. The first step in the weaving process is wrapping the warp. If you're dealing with a couple of different colors, rule of thumb is to run the darker color front to back. That'll be your warp. Start by attaching the material right here on the side. We're going to be using an upholstery tack, but if you have a pneumatic stapler, you can use a pneumatic stapler, or if you would prefer, you can use masking tape and just wrap and tape the material to the end. You don't want it right up against the post. You want to back it off about a 1/2 inch. And we're going to put this tack in on the side so that when it's hammered in, it isn't on the top of the rail and having a tendency to rub. If you have metal sticking up here on the top, when your other strands come through, it could rub on that metal and fray your material. When wrapping the warp, it's awfully helpful to have it in a nice coil like this. The hardest thing about shaker tape is that it tries to twist on you. So by having it in a roll, you can literally just wrap it around the rails. For right now, we're just going to wrap material. We're not worried about tension. We're just getting the material on the rails themselves. By leaving the warp strands loose, I have space to easily fit the foam in. And then focus on the tension. Now is when it's helpful to have a clamp. You want to pull the strands taut, but not tight. We're not trying to pull these so that you're throwing your shoulder out. You're not trying to pull them really tight. You're just taking the slack out of them. If you pull the warp strands too tight, it's really difficult, almost impossible to weave through the weft strands. As you're tensioning the strands, you want to make sure that they're not on top of each other, here in the back or in the front, but you do want them to be nudged right next to each other. If at any point you have to stop, put a clamp, and then you can give your hands a rest. When using the clamp, you want to make sure that your clamp is on the rail and not to this side of the rail. If you clamp on all the way around the rail, then you've taken up some slack in the material, and it's not going to be as tight once you remove the clamp. We're ready to put the last strand on the warp, and there's not quite enough room for it to fit, but there is some extra space in here. So we're going to squish these strands together as much as possible. Moving those materials, now we've got plenty of space for the last one. If after squishing all these together you still don't have enough space, you would never want these to run on top of each other. Instead, you'd take the extra space and kind of even it out amongst the strands. Once the back rail is totally full, then we're going to flip the chair over and attach this strand down here on the side rail. I'm putting the tack here. On the bottom, it's okay to put the tack directly on the bottom. The hardest part about the tacks is avoiding your rails here. And we'll cut the tail off. Again, leaving about a ½ inch or so between your strand and the post. You are always going to have some kind of a splay in here. Don't worry about that. Once the weaving starts, this will get pulled in close and you won't notice the difference. Because the chair is wider on the front than it is on the back, you have these extra spaces in here called a gusset. We're going to start on the left-hand side and starting with a tack just like this one. You don't want to put the tack right here, and you don't want to put the tack way back here. You want to try to keep this pattern as parallel as possible as you're going through. So we're going to go right here. When the strand is attached on the front side, wrap it around and then attach it on the bottom side. Attaching it on the bottom side, we'll attach right here on the side rail, and it's really going to mirror the way that we had just attached the other end of the warp last time. I'm going to run this and keep it as parallel as possible. It's really going to mirror the beginning strand over here. Wrap around to the bottom side, just like we did before. I'm going to run right next to this one and put a tack in on the bottom side. We still have space on the front rail, since these guys mirror each other, we're going to put one in here that is, it might not directly mirror, but it's going to be close. The tack placement, again, you're trying not up here and not way back here, but keeping everything as parallel as possible. And we're back to the bottom side with another tack. So we've put in one fill-in strand on this side and two on this side, but really the original strand that we started with acts as a fill-in. We still have a little bit more room on the front rail, probably enough for one more strand. You want to try to keep these warp strands as perpendicular to the frame as possible. Here at the end, we're going to have to shove it one way or the other. So you do the best that you can. I'm going to run in this direction and move all these strands over in the hopes to have enough space on this side to put one more fill-in strand. There we go. So we got enough space to do one more strand, and then our warps will be done. Warp strands completed and ready to start weaving. So even using the more conservative method to figure out what yardage we need, we only ended up with about 1.5 yards left. That just goes to show you it's always better to purchase a little more material than you think you're going to need, because you'd hate to run up short. A little bit on the tension. It is taut, but not tight. You could stretch these strands, which allows you to get under them and over them multiple times in the weaving process. We're going to be weaving the chair with a checkerboard top and a herringbone bottom. And with those two kind of most simplistic styles, they can be combined to do all kinds of a lot more complicated styles, whether it is diamonds or chevrons or a style of your own making. We're starting on the bottom of the chair. So I'm taking the strand, tucking it underneath the last two, pulling it up onto this rail, and then splaying these strands apart. And what we're going to do is put a tack right there in the middle. Be careful when you're making or hammering that tack in. If you hit too much on the cotton material, it'll burnish it and make a nasty mark. One of the hardest things with weaving shaker tape is that it will try to twist on you. So we're going to try to figure out top side, bottom side just once. I like to use this wonderful unrolling trick, and at this point you really want to make sure that your floor is clean or your table is clean, especially if you're using this natural color, because it picks up dirt and fuzz a lot. We figured out that this is the way that we want to be weaving across here. If you fold the end over, create a pocket. And it doesn't take a whole lot of tape, but now I have a pocket that you can use a screwdriver and then weave with the screwdriver. Being concerned about the material twisting, it's nice to have that loop, and a lot of folks are like, well, you always know what the top is because you know where the pocket is. Not really the case, because that can twist. The pocket's still on the top side, and you've got a twist in your material. So I'll be showing you a way to counteract that. For the herringbone pattern on the bottom, it's a 2 over, 2 under pattern. And when I say under, I mean under the warp strands, and then these next are going to be over these 2 warp strands. 2 under, 2 over, 2 under, 2 under, 2 over, 2 under. It just so happened that we ended up with 2 under, but you might not. There could be a single here on the end. This one time, I'll be pulling all the material through. I'm losing my top and the bottom. I don't know where my top and bottom is. This first strand and all the strands on the bottom will be at a slight angle. That's expected. In order for the strands to be straight on the top, you have to have a slight angle at the bottom. This is my normal weaving setup, where I'll be weaving from right to left with the chair facing me. And then if you pretend like there's a hinge at the bottom here, and you can just flip your chair forward and weave through the bottom, and then flip it back. And we're doing that flip forward and flip back because we don't want to get into that. Today, for video purposes, I'm going to be working a little differently. So we're going to be working with the chair facing you, and then coming up with the back facing me. This is not how I'd usually weave. Since we've pulled all of the material through, who knows what the top and bottom is? We have to figure it out again. I'm taking this material and knowing that I'm weaving through this way, come through and sort out, not let it twist. If you had to do that every time you flip the chair over, it would take forever and it would be so annoying. So we'll show you a way that that's the last time I'm gonna have to sort that out. Unless something gets amiss, which it happens, you just resort it. On the top side, we're gonna be doing a checkerboard pattern, which is a 1 under, 1 over. For whatever reason, I do like to start under. There you go, 1 over, 1 under. And this checkerboard pattern gives you the strongest seat. Now, at this point, if I pull all this material through, my top and bottom is all messed up again. And I can't reiterate how important it is. Just pull a little bit through. I know where my top is, my bottom is, and how I'm going to weave. I'm taking this tail and just stick it somewhere in the pattern where you know that this is the direction that you're weaving and there's no twist in the material. Now I can take and pull all the material through and pull it taut. And then pull this material towards yourself. With a checkerboard pattern, it's always helpful to have a slight bow. Naturally, the pattern tries to bow this direction. And so if you pre-bow it towards yourself, it'll help you out here in the back. This is the tail that I've tucked underneath, so I know that I'm weaving, and this is my top and bottom, weaving in this direction. The herringbone pattern that we're going to be weaving on the back is a 2 over, 2 under, but with a step back. Here, over these last time, we're going to go taking a step back and go over these next time. Once you've figured out how to start, then you're back to the 2 over, 2 under the entire way across. And you'll notice, once I pull this up close, that we have this stair step that is the herringbone pattern. At this point, we don't want to pull the entire strand through, but I want enough to be able to weave through the top and determine my top and bottom easily. We're using this herringbone pattern on the bottom because it is a little easier to deal with. There's less over and unders, and it's easier to push the material close together, but you have a little looser seat. Now with your chair back upright, we're ready to continue the pattern on the top. I only have enough material pulled through to get through this top portion. You're going to go the exact opposite to the last time. So where you were over, now you are under. Okay, this is locked down. I'm going to pull all the material and get it pulled taut. And you can pull this material pretty taut. And give it a tug. This is what gives you the strength. Pull just enough and tuck it underneath as we did the first time around. Now I'm pulling through and coming back and forth. I find that it's a lot easier to pull the slack out of your pattern with your chair standing upright. So every time I weave through the top, I know that I'm going to be pulling the slack out twice. You want these guys to be as close to each other as possible, but they don't really start getting close until you get some more strands behind them. We're back on the bottom with the herringbone pattern. Sometimes it's a little tricky to figure out where you need to go on the edge. So I'm going to keep this tucked in for the moment. Sometimes it's easier to go into the middle of the pattern and create a stair step with a small piece of scrap. I've got the stair step pattern going. I know I need to be over these two, so I'm over, under, over. I'm using a longer tool from here on out. It's much easier to work with. You can get all the way across the chair without having to readjust. Now just pull enough through in order to weave through the top, and then we'll be flipping the chair. Continuing the pattern opposite to the last strand. And notice I'm pushing down instead of getting my fingers in the pattern. This is locked down. Pulling through the excess once. Pulling just enough to tuck into the bottom. Pulling the excess again. So a reminder that we're weaving with the chair facing away from us for video purposes, but you'll be weaving from this direction, and it's much easier to pull these strands tight when you're pulling them towards yourself instead of pushing them, which is one of the reasons that we start at the front of the chair. are at the edge, and I have a decision to make. Do I go under this last one or over it? I think I can do that without riding too close to this tack. So I'm going to go for it. On the bottom side, you can run these strands pretty close to the tacks. On the top, it's better not to. At this point, I'm going to pretend like this is a part of the rail and just go completely over the top of it. If you do decide to get or try to get under this strand, then what ends up happening is that the next strand that comes across, that I'll mimic like this, you end up with a little pocket. And the seat looks funny. And go over both of these now. Once you have a few strands in, you can start to notice some of these little spaces in here. We want to take all these little extra gaps out so that your weaving strands don't bow way up here in the back. Working one strand at a time and nudging this material right next to the strand behind it. And work your way from the front of the chair to the back. I find that it's easiest to use a lever technique, and sometimes you have to brace yourself in the chair. And you'll see the amount of space that we've gotten just by moving a few strands. But you want to stop and compress your material every 3 or 4 strands. And this goes for on the edge as well. If you have any gaps on the edge, on the rail, you want to make sure to push those out. Here we are at another tack, and the pattern would require me to go under this strand. But like previously, if I go under that strand, it's going to cause a divot in the pattern. I'm just going over the top of both of them. As I was pulling material back and forth, I ended up with a twist. And that happens. The easiest way to deal with that is to take the twist, push it close to your pattern. And then we're good as new. These gaps have come in again, so it's time to compress the pattern. A little bit of space on the edge, and I want to take care of that as well. You don't have to go all the way back to the front every time, but overlap a little bit from where you compressed last time. back to adjusting. You can see that it's starting to bow backwards. And as we get closer to this back rail, these warp strands are tighter and tighter and harder to weave through. So you want as much of that material as possible. That's why we've been adjusting the entire time. While I'm adjusting, you'll see that there are some wrinkles in the material. That's normal. A little bit of wrinkling is worth it in order to make the space that you need to weave more material onto the seat. Under usage, the wrinkles stretch themselves out as the seat settles. These last few strands that we're putting in, with the warp being so tight, you really have to fight for each one. At some point, it can be difficult to move the material, and it can be helpful to have a second tool to use as a ramp. Here we are close to the end of our side rail, and there's not enough space to fit another strand in. The option is this. You can try to move all of these strands up and scoot these as far frontwards as you can, and maybe you can fit a strand in. With the shaker tape, I'm all right if it bunches a little bit on the back, but I don't want it bunching that much. I'm going to try to do that and see what happens. After a bit more effort, we've made space for one last row back here. It's going to be a pain to get through. Sometimes it's really difficult to get all the way across. If you want to stop halfway and pull the strand through, you can. Or sometimes it's helpful to go from this way, behind that back post. That was the last row on the top. Let's flip it over and put the last row in on the bottom. I'm back here on the other side of the table, so that you guys can get a little better angle on this last row on the bottom. So we're going to come across here and stay in the pattern as much as possible, ultimately wanting to tack the material somewhere on this back row where it's hidden, similarly to the way that we started. This last strand we've woven through, keeping the pattern. Because of the way this has turned out, we're able to kind of pull through and pull everything taut. Your ending is different with every chair. I'm pulling it taut. I'm going to pull this last strand up onto the back rail, put a tack there, cut here, and tuck the tail underneath. In order to not damage this material, I'm going to use a punch for the last bit. You can use a large nail the same way, although a proper punch makes life a lot easier. All right. Now at this point, take some time and tidy up the bottom if there's any messy bits. If you've got gaps, you can shuffle your pattern around and just kind of even those gaps out. A lot of times there's gaps on the edges here because of the fill-in strands. So you take a minute, and you're not going to get rid of all of them, but shuffling your material around in order to make a uniform pattern that's most pleasing to the eye, even though it's the bottom. Weaving is done. There's a few tweaks to make. You want to push some strands closer together, and a lot of times on these edges here. And this isn't a tweak as much as feels right to you. Ultimately trying to get these as square as possible. Looks right to me. If there's any gaps on the rails, just kind of move things around so that those gaps are distributed between the strands. Once your chair is woven, over time, we've mentioned it can fade. You can use the Scotch Guard on cotton that will help, and it'll help with stains. As far as cleaning goes, a good vacuuming will do just fine. Thank you for taking your time watching the Silver River Chairs channel. Please come visit our website for more information on seat weaving instruction.